All right, hello everyone.
Can you hear me now? Echoing. Why is it echoing like that? Okay. Okay. Nothing. But I can hear myself from here.
Hello everybody, welcome to this week's session. It's exactly, let me see the time, this is exactly 11:17 a.m. We promise to start 11 o'clock on the dot. However, we're starting now. So today we'll be looking at Metasploit, its exploitation tactics, and the likes. So what is Metasploit? In the course of today's lectures and practicals and access to our labs, we'll be going through what Metasploit is. So by way of introduction, I'm Victor Idono by name, and I'm doing the opening session already. In the course of today's hands-on session, we will be learning what Metasploit is. In order not to spoil what we have on ground for today, I'll just take us briefly on, or let me just leave all of that for the session. So please, if you have any question, if you have any comment, feel free to comment. As the session is ongoing, we'll be monitoring the sessions for live comments and all of that, and we will be responding to that. Feel free to raise your hand, make your comment, and it will be attended to. And always feel free to ask questions where necessary. For those of us that joined us last week, I believe you're conversant with the labs already, how to navigate through. We covered all of that session last week. So just in case you're joining us for the first time, not to worry, right? You will definitely, after this session, you will be able to still watch the video on how to navigate through the labs and the academy and every other thing that you have access to. As always, if you need access to anything, do not forget to send us a mail to support@365global.com or info@upgradedera.com. We will respond to your email, and all of your inquiries or issues will be attended to if there's any. So let's move on to what we have for today. We are behind schedule, and let's take it up from there. So over to David. David, over to you.
All right, good morning once again. So we'll be looking at Metasploit and its exploitation tactics. And then for today, we're going to be having a theoretical approach to learning Metasploit. So we're going to be looking at it in theory, and then we're going to be having a practical session for about an hour. Then there'll be room for discussions before we conclude the session. So just PS before we begin, so it's prerequisite for us to have Metasploitable installed on your virtual machine or virtual box, as that will be our target application for today. So in the course of learning the theoretical approach to the topic for today, you can use that time to download the machine before we get to the practical session. All right, thank you very much. So for today's session, we want to ensure that first of all, we're able to understand the fundamental and architecture of Metasploit. We want to understand how to find vulnerable systems and its architecture. And finally, we want to learn how to use Metasploit to exploit vulnerable systems and architecture. Now, by way of introduction, penetration testing, often called pen testing or ethical hacking, is a simulated cyber attack against your own cyber computer system, network, or web application to check for exploitable vulnerabilities. So we understand that we are doing this for test purposes, so definitely it has to be our own computer system or our own network or web application to check for exploitable vulnerabilities. So these are the loopholes that you can identify yourself in your systems or your lab, and then you're able to exploit them based on the vulnerabilities you find. So the primary goal is to identify security weaknesses before malicious attackers can find and exploit them. So you're simulating what a thief would do if he was to break into your system. So you find how a thief is going to break in, and then since you found how a thief is going to break in, you know how to protect from such attacks. So it's a proactive security measure. Now we go into Metasploit as a framework. So Metasploit Framework is an open source exploitation framework maintained by Rapid7. It contains a suite of tools for exploitation of known vulnerabilities, payload generation, post-exploitation, auxiliary tasks such as scanning, parsing, and the likes. Also, Metasploit can be used to create custom exploits. So Metasploit comes in very much handy when you have a penetration exercise to do, where you have activities such as exploiting of vulnerabilities that you've confirmed. You want to generate payloads for your exploits. You want to carry out post-exploitation activities such like remote connections. And also for scanning purposes, also Metasploit gives a very much impressive room for such kind of activities. And then also it can also be used for creating customized exploits. So you can write your exploits and use Metasploit to run your exploits on the test subject. So why Metasploit? First things first, Metasploit saves time. So this is because it includes hundreds of pre-written exploits. So majority of the time, you don't need to customize your own exploits. Metasploit comes with quite a number of exploits that can easily run your tasks for you. Also, it is modular. It is easy to plug in exploits, payloads, and targets. Basically, it's simple to use. Metasploit is just you understanding how the system works and understanding what you're looking for. And by so doing, you'll be able to run your exploits and perform your exploitation the way you like. Lastly, Metasploit is very much popular, so it's widely used for scenarios like the OSCP, the CEH, and also for red teaming activities. Metasploit comes in very handy, even for scenarios where you have to perform things like silver or gold tickets, and Metasploit helps you with that. Now, what's the role of Metasploit in the PT lifecycle, also called the penetration testing lifecycle? The Metasploit framework is a powerful open source platform that significantly aids in the scanning, exploitation, and post-exploitation phase of penetration testing. It provides a vast collection of exploits, payloads, and tools that streamline the process of identifying and leveraging vulnerabilities. So basically what we are trying to say here is Metasploit is a tool that gives you the room to perform a handful of operations, such as scanning for exploits that you've confirmed already, called auxiliary modules in Metasploit. Also exploiting the payloads that you find that can be used for the vulnerability that has been confirmed. And also post-exploitation phases in pen testing, such as having a shell upon completion of your exploits. Like we said before, it provides a vast collection of exploits, payloads, and tools that streamline the process of identifying and leveraging vulnerabilities. So it gives you a linear pathway to performing your exploit. Now, what are the major things to know when using Metasploit? So we have the Metasploit framework concepts. First of all is the MSF console, which is called the main CLI, the command line interface for interacting with modules. So Metasploit gives you a CLI for you to use the auxiliary modules and for navigation purposes. MSF Venom, which is called a payload generator tool. So alongside generating exploits, MSF Venom Metasploit helps with a tool used to generate payloads that can be patched with deliverables like applications and software in cases where you're trying to make a vulnerable software for test purposes. MSF Venom under the Metasploit framework does that for you. Modules contain exploits, payloads, and auxiliary tools. So basically, for every exploit you are trying to carry out, every payload, every auxiliary tool you're going to be using, they come in modules. So the module is the umbrella for all these things. Sessions. So sessions track the current shells and metafilter session. So upon post-exploitation, when you've gotten your shell, the sessions here enable you with the ability to keep a session upon completion. That way you know that you have a session currently going, and then you can also carry out activities on the other sessions. Now a database, which is optional, you don't get to use it as much as such. Optional PostgreSQL database for saving loops and hosts. So Metasploit framework gives you a dummy DB where you can save anything, you can save your exploits, you can save hosts, and whatsoever things you want to save for future referencing. Quite optional because you don't get to use it very much often. Now, what are the key Metasploit terms to be used when using Metasploit? First, a payload. What is a payload? A payload is a code delivered after exploitation. For example, a shell, a metafilter. Two, the exploit. What's an exploit? An exploit is a code that takes advantage of a vulnerability. What's a module? A module is a reusable unit in Metasploit. So, an exploit, a payload, an auxiliary tool, as long as it's reusable in Metasploit, it's called a module. So basically, when you use an exploit and the exploit is saved somewhere for you to use, for further sake, either it's a customized exploit or it's an exploit that came with Metasploit on its own, it's called a module. Now, a listener. What's a listener? A listener waits for a reverse shell to connect back. So think of a listener as a person with a phone waiting for an incoming phone call from a remote location. So he waits for shell for it to connect back upon carrying out your exploit. And then lastly, what's a session? A session represents an open connection to the exploited target. Now, let's look at all of this in details. Now, modules. These are the building blocks of Metasploit. Each is designed for a specific task. For example, an exploit. An exploit is a code that takes advantage of a specific vulnerability in a system or an application to gain unauthorized access to achieve a specific objective, either remote code execution, whatever the case is. So an exploit basically is a piece of code or a line of code that can be used to exploit a vulnerability in a system for the sake of unauthorized access or for test purposes. So exploits varies based on types. Some do not come as piece of code. Some are basically programs or softwares that have been patched. Now for payloads are small pieces of code that the exploit delivers to the target after successful exploitation. The payload defines what actions you want the exploited system to perform, e.g. open a shell, establish a Metasploit session. So after running an exploit, a payload comes into play. So we think of a payload as what happens when an exploit runs. So for example, you rob a house and what you were able to exploit to robbing the house is the door that was not open. So what you were able to use to exploit there was the door. But what happens when you rob is actually the payload. Do you steal money or do you kill your victims? So the payload is an aftermath of the exploits that is being run. Now, auxiliaries. Auxiliaries are modules that perform tasks other than direct exploitations. This includes scanners, port scanners, vulnerability scanners, login brute forcers, denial of service tools, frauders, and administrative functions. They gather information or perform specific actions without delivering a payload. So what an auxiliary module or an auxiliary tool does is it helps you with cases where you have to brute force or you have to scan. So Metasploit doesn't just help you to perform exploitation by just getting shells. It also helps you to brute force protocol, which we are going to be looking at today for our test subjects. It also helps in case where you have to brute force protocols like the SSH and whatever the case may be. So it helps you to brute force for valid login credentials. It also helps in forcing mechanisms, denial of service tools, and also scanning for vulnerabilities on ports. So you can also use Metasploit as a recon tool to gather information to perform specific actions without you necessarily delivering a payload. So upon scanning and upon forcing or brute forcing, you're able to get valid login credentials or valid credentials that can now be used elsewhere for your case study. Now an encoder is a tool used to encode payloads to bypass basic antivirus signatures or to avoid bad characters that might break the exploits. So basically, an encoder is a tool that is used to obfuscate or change the format of a payload in order to bypass antivirus signatures to avoid flagging, blacklistings for the sake of successfully running your exploit. Now, what are the major key commands in Metasploit or MSF console? As we discussed before, the Metasploit gives us a console called MSF console, which acts as a CLI for us to run the package. Now, the first key command here is the search command. So because you have a large library of exploits and a bank of payloads to use, you don't have all of them right off the bat in your head. You most likely want to search for the exploits you're using as part of your recon procedures. So search helps you to check for the exploits you're looking for in the MSF console if Metasploit has that particular exploit in its library. Use. Now the use command is used to basically use the exploit you found. So if you find an exploit, take for example, you find a module or a library that helps you scan for vulnerabilities on a particular protocol, you can use the command use this particular exploit or this particular library before you begin to use the exploit command. Now show options. Now for every exploit you want to run, there are prerequisites that must be met. This enables Metasploit to perform its action appropriately. For example, you want to set your target host network. You want to set your network as the attacker. You want to set the network of the person you're trying to use as a test application. You also want to set, most times when you're performing vulnerability scannings or brute forcing, you want to set the parameters you use for brute forcing, such as the username, and then the passwords. If you have a list, you want to set the username list and the password list. That way, Metasploit has what to work with to avoid negative connections or misappropriation when using Metasploit. Also, show payloads. Show payloads helps you to identify all the payloads in a module. So you can have modules that have multiple sessions, that have multiple payloads under them. And then Metasploit helps you see all the payloads for your own sake. That way you have what to work with. Also, set payload. Now, upon showing payload, you can decide to use a particular payload. And for every payload you want to use, you want to set basic parameters that should be used for your payload to run successfully. And then finally, you have the run /the exploit command. So this can be used interchangeably. So upon setting everything you need to set, you set all your properties ready, or your prerequisites are up and running. You want to use the run command or the exploit command to tell Metasploit to begin its process of exploitation. Now let's dive into the attack vectors, or call them the protocols. So basically, these are the pathways or the protocols that a cyber attacker uses to gain unauthorized access to a computer system or a network or an application. So you think of it as the door that gives the attacker room for exploitation. We're looking at them as this will be our vectors for the practical session today. We have quite a number of them, but we'll just limit them to a particular few. First of all, we have Telnet, which runs on port 23, which acts as a medium of file exchange or file transfer. Although it's quite old, you find applications that still use Telnet. Secondly, we have the file transfer protocol, popularly known as the FTP, which runs on port 21, which is also another protocol used for file transfer. Thirdly, we have the server message block, SMB, which runs on port 139 and port 445. Then we have the simple mail transfer protocol, SMTP, which runs on port 25. And we have the secure shell known as SSH, which runs on port 22. We also have the My Structured Query language called MySQL, which runs on port 3306. Now let's look at this individually. Now, Telnet is an application layer protocol used on the internet or on local area networks to provide a bidirectional interactive text-oriented communication facility using a virtual terminal connection. So basically, it allows you to remotely log into another computer and execute commands as if you were sitting in front of the other computer, as long as you are connected on the same local area network. So Telnet does not encrypt the authentication process or any subsequent data, which makes it very highly vulnerable to eavesdropping and credential theft. Although Telnet is now outdated, as most applications do not use it because of its vulnerability due to the lack of encryption on the authentication process for sessions, then you still have some applications that still run on Telnet. Secondly, FTP, or the File Transfer Protocol. is a standard network protocol used to transfer computer files from a server to a client on a computer network. It's one of the oldest and most widely used application layer protocols for file transfer. Some of the FTP vulnerabilities include anonymous login enabled, weak or default credentials, directory traversal, etc. So, like Telnet, FTP is also a network protocol used to transfer files from computer devices on a computer network, basically from a server to a client. So, FTP has a number of vulnerabilities. For example, the anonymous login, which is constantly enabled for most applications. And then we also have default and weak credentials. And then directory traversal, which is the ability for you to write or retrieve contents of a file on a directory that is sitting on the computer network through the FTP protocol. SMB, or the server message block, is a network file sharing protocol that allows application on a computer to read and write the files and request to read and write the files and to request services from server programs in a computer network. So it's most commonly associated with Windows files and printer sharing, but also used on Linux Unix systems via something known as the Samba. So SMB, like FCP, SSH, is also a medium for file sharing. It's also a file sharing protocol that allows applications to read and write files to request services from several programs on the computer network. So basically, it enables group of computers to communicate and also share files, read and write those files, which is commonly used in Windows systems. But it's used on Linux and Unix systems via something known as the Samba protocol. Now we'll move to SSH. So SSH, or the secure shell, is more like an upgrade of the Telnet. So due to the facts and due to the heavy vulnerability found on Telnet, you have the SSH, which is an improvement of Telnet, which is a cryptographic network protocol for operating network services securely over an unsecured network. So its most common application is for remote command login and remote command execution, effectively providing a secure replacement for Telnet. So like I said before, it was a secure replacement for Telnet, just the fact that Telnet is heavily filled with vulnerabilities. So SSH became an improvement to securely replace Telnet. Finally, we'll move to HTTP. Finally, we move to HTTP, which is the foundation of data communication for the World Wide Web. It's an application layer protocol for transmitting hypermedia documents, such as the HTML. It is the protocol that allows you to load web pages. So HTTP, which runs on port 80, is the foundation for data communication for the World Wide Web, also known as the WWW. It's an application layer protocol for transmitting hypermedia documents such as HTML, JS, and CSS. It is the protocol that allows you to load web pages. So basically, all of these protocols that have been discussed as attack vectors are going to be our test victims for our vulnerable application in our practical session today. So having looked at all of this theoretically, we're going to be looking at how we can do this practically on our test subjects. So I believe by now everybody has Metasploit downloaded and installed on his VirtualBox so that we can follow along on what we are doing today. So for our practical session today, our target application is the Metasploit VM. And then for our exercises on our labs, we have a number of exercises here. We have the protocol hacking 1, 2, and 3, which are going to be our test subjects on Hack 365 today. Now, having said all of this, it's time for us to go into our attack box and our attack machine for us to begin properly. Thank you very much. Now, first of all, we want to have Metasploitable up and running on our virtual machine. So right here we see we have Metasploitable 2. I have Metasploitable 2 running here in the virtual machine. Then we start our machine. Okay, so now that we have Metasploitable up and running, it tells us to log in with msfadmin/msfadmin to get started. So basically, you have msfadmin as both the login and your password on Metasploitable 2. So that is what we're going to do right now. We have msfadmin and msfadmin, and we're in. So we have our vulnerable network and our vulnerable machine up and running. Now let's begin. Now we move to our hacking machine. So msfadmin or Metasploitable 2 is simulating your Metasploitable 2 is simulating your local area network that has vulnerabilities. And of course, since it's a host network, you know it has everything that a host network is supposed to have. So it has its IP addresses, it has everything, and then we'll look. For today, we're going to be looking at all the protocols that are up and running. And then once we can get that, from there we begin our hacking procedure. You understand? So now, first things first, we want to identify the IP address of Metasploitable 2 or our, for instance, vulnerable network or vulnerable application. So we use the nmap command, which we learned last week, and we're going to be scanning through the whole subnet so we can identify live hosts. And once that is done, we're able to identify the IP address of Metasploitable 2. Then we move on from there. So we do that by using the command nmap 192.168.56.0/24. So this would run a network scanning on all the machines on that subnet, giving us the IP address of live machines and live hosts for us to identify Metasploitable 2. When we hit enter, just zoom in. Okay, so upon running our scan, we see that we pulled off a number of results. So it tells us, the nmap tells us the host is up, all 1000 scan ports on this are in ignored states, and we have a bunch of information. But then we see that we have a machine that is up and running on IP address 192.168.56.102, meaning our Metasploitable machine is running on that particular network. So moving on, we can now see all the protocols that are running on Metasploitable 2 So we have FTP running on 21, SSH running on 22, Telnet running on 23, SMTP running on 25, the domain running on 53, HTTP, and the likes. So for our test today, we're going to be taking this as randoms, and we'll see how we can exploit at least 5 of these, and we'll look at the methodology as to exploiting all of these things. That way we're able to establish how exploitation works in a penetration testing system. Now, before you proceed, please microphone in case you have any questions. We don't get this one. So you just do it. All right. So first things first. Remember we said we're going to be using Metasploitable or Metasploit as our exploitation framework for the day. So the first thing we want to do is to spin up the Metasploit console using the MSF console command. So for that, you can just go into a new tab. And we use the command MSF console. As you can see, it tells you starting the Metasploit Framework console. So this would boot and launch the Metasploit package for us to use. As you can see, Metasploit is up and running for us to use. Okay, so now that Metasploit has loaded successfully, we want to see how we can use this to exploit all of the vulnerabilities now, or some of the vulnerabilities, or some of the protocols that are on Metasploit itself as protocols. Now, first things first, for us to properly do that, you must understand that there's a number of things you should know, which is, as much as you performed Nmap on your targets, which we were able to justify last week in terms of definition and methodology, as much as you performed a network scan on your target, you want to perform a scan such that you're able to understand the versions of the services running on the on your application. So you don't just scan for FTP, you want to know what version of FTP server is running on the application, as you have a variety of FTP servers everywhere. Last week we were able to look at an application that had the full FTPD server running. What if for this case you have an application that is running a different type of FTP server and the likes? All of this information come in handy as there are patches and exploits that are attached to the majority of all of these servers. So in the light of that, we would want to do another Nmap scan such that we want to know the versions of the services that are running. If we take a look at the previous scan we ran, we just saw the services. So this gives us limited information. It just tells us that there is an FTP server, or there is a Telnet server, there's an SMTP server, and whatever the case is. We want to know more than this. We want to know the server, the type of FTP server that is running. We want to know the type of Telnet server that is running. We want to know the type of SMTP server that is running. That way we have more information to work with. As before you begin any exploitation, one of the first things you want to have is the mindset of reconnaissance, which is gathering as much information as possible. Reconnaissance. You want to gather as much information as possible such that you don't hack or you don't just test blindly and leave you on the same page. All right. So in light of that, we're going to be doing another Nmap scan. So we're going to be running an Nmap scan with the command nmap -t4 -sv. So because we're looking at the versions, we want to know the versions on the service protocols, we use the command -sv. -sv, that would give us information on the versions of the protocols running and whatever the case is. So having done this, -sv, then we specify our IP address, which is 192.168.56.102. Just take a while to confirm. Oh yes, we have this here. So we run this command and we wait for it to give us the results of our network scanning. Let's wait for it for a while. Now? Yes. So Nmap, as covered last week, so I'm guessing we're now on last week for this session. So Nmap is a tool that is used for network vulnerability scanning or network scanning in general. So Nmap helps you to know what systems are up, what systems are open, what protocols are open in the system, what port is open up, what is closed up, what is filtered, what port is unfiltered. So depending on your case scenario and what you are looking for, Nmap gives you the flexibility of choice of how you want to run your scan. As you can see, prior to now, we ran a scan that just told us what was up and the services that we're running. Now we want to customize the scan. I want the scan to tell us what is running, but tell us what type of service is running. So what I'm saying is, I don't just want to know what kind of door. I don't want to just know that there is a door in the parlor in this house. I want to know the type of door that is in the parlor, because my plan is to enter. So I need to know if it's a wooden door or it's an iron door. Understand? So that's what we're trying to do now. So prior to now, run a scan that told us the ports that are open and the ports that are present. But now we want to know the type, the services exactly that, the type of services that those ports use, the versions of the ports itself that is using. For example, SSH, we want to know the kind of SSH server that is present. We want to know the kind of FTP server that is present. That way we have more information to work with, because we are looking at exploitation. Now our scan is up and running. And if you notice, we have more information now because we have an extra column that tells us version. Prior to now, we had just 3 columns you could see. You could just see the ports, the states, whether it's open or closed. And then we have the service, which is the FTP, SSH, and whatever the case is. But now, upon customizing our scan, we see that we have more information. So for FTP, we see that the kind of FTP server that is running here is the VS FTPD 2.3.4. So now I have more information to work with. So when I'm looking for a form of exploit, I look for an exploit on this version of FTP. It's that simple. When I look at SSH, we see that it uses an open SSH 4.7 P1 and whatever the case is. That way, I have more information to work with for my exploitation sake. Same with HTTP, we see the Apache server that is running 2.2.8. Same with SMB 139 and 455, we see that it's running the Samba SBD. Although this doesn't tell us fully the full type of version that is running here, would have to go a step further if we're going to identify this, which is something we're going to be doing today, most likely. We also have another FTP port on 2121. Request, you see that it's a Pro FTPD 1.3.1. This tells you that you can have FTP servers that are different. One is using a VS FTPD 2.3.1. Another one is using Pro FTPD 1.3.1. And they are both FTP servers. But the one is running on 21, the other one is running on auxiliary ports, probably 21.21. So we also have the VNC server 5900. and we see the protocol, we see that it uses the DNC protocol, keep my face. And then, yes, so that is that for our Nmap scan. So having done this now, we now have an idea of what we're going to be looking for when we want to exploit. So for sake of demonstration, the first thing we want to look at, we'll begin our exploit by using, we could start with the FTP service. So let's see how we can exploit FTP on this particular machine. Remember, Metasploitable is still our vulnerable machine. Metasploitable is still our test subject for today's session. Now, let's head over to Metasploitable. Now, we have an FTP server that runs on VSFTPD 2.3.4. So we want to search Metasploitable to see if it has exploits on this particular version of FTP. If it has exploits here, we can now use this to perform what we want to do, looking at our case scenario. Now, so what you just want to do is you want to search, and we're searching for VSFTPD. And then once we hit enter, we see that there is a VSFTPD vulnerability, which is a backdoor command execution. So there is an exploit in Metasploitable that gives you access to a backdoor in the FTP protocol on this particular version. So it is the VSFTPD 234 backdoor. So I'm guessing this is 2.3.4 backdoor. The rank is excellent. Check description, VSFTPD version 2.3.4 backdoor command execution, meaning that there is a vulnerability for this version of FTP, and the vulnerability is on Metasploit. So having seen that the vulnerability is on Metasploit, we can now use the vulnerability or this exploit to run our tests. And then from there, we can supposedly hack the system through FTP and gain access, unauthorized access to FTP using Metasploit and this exploit. So since we are going to be using this exploit, VSFTPD 234 backdoor, which is number 1. You can see there's number 0 and there's number 1. We're going to, so there are 2 different exploits. It's just this is a list of models. This is a different exploit entirely. This is an auxiliary. This is not an exploit. This is an auxiliary. Remember in my slides, you said an auxiliary models are not necessarily exploits. They come as scanners, because Metasploit gives you an avenue to not just perform an exploit alone, but you can also perform operations like scanning, brute forcing, fuzzing, and at case points in view. We're going to be looking at other protocols where we have to brute force, and then in such scenarios we don't use an exploit. In those scenarios we don't use an exploit. What we are using there is an auxiliary module, and what the auxiliary module does is to scan, so or to perform login brute force. So in that case, since here we're using an exploit which is specific to what we're looking for, we're going to be using number 1, not number 0. So on your Metasploit, on your console, you type use 1. That way, it tells you, as you can see now, you are in the exploit full time, and the MSF console, which is the FTPD, VSFTPD 234 backdoor, is now live and running. That way, we have our exploit. So now, remember in our definition, we said as much as there is a search command, as much as you want to use your exploits, you want to set your exploit to perform optimally. So there are properties and parameters you have to set, because you want Metasploit to perform what you want it to perform. So you have a successful exploit. Now that Metasploit is up and running, and we've identified our exploits, use the command show options. So when we decide to show options, we see a list of options that we need to set for us to use the exploit. Now, you see, there's a description for a local client address, which is called the C host. Is it required? No. So it means you do not have to set that. There is a C port, the local client port. Is it required? No. These are the requirements that must be met for this exploit to run successfully. Now, for proxies, there's a proxy chain of formats, type host ports, type host ports, and whatever the case is. Is it required? No. So the two required things here is the R host and the R port. What is the R host? The R host is the target host, which is what Metasploitable for this case. Please, Metasploitable is different from Metasploit. They are not the same thing. Metasploitable is our attack machine, or is our victim machine. Metasploit is the tool we are using. So now, our R host here, which is in our case, the Metasploitable machine. So we have to set the IP address or the target IP address for our R host, so that we can have we direct Metasploitable, we direct Metasploit or MSF console on where to target the exploits to. And remember, from our Nmap scan that we ran, in the Nmap scan we ran, we're able to identify the IP address of Metasploitable or our victim application as 192.168.56.102. So what we have to do is we have to set this IP address as the target machine on Metasploit. So to do that, we use the set command. So we type set our hosts as 192.168.56.102. Then we hit enter. As you can see, it has successfully set the R host to be 192.168.56.102. Now, in order for us to just confirm this before we move on, we want to check again by using the same command, show options. So as you can see, it has updated the current settings. So you have the R host set as the Metasploitable's IP address. So having met all the requirements that is need to be met, now we can now use the exploit command or the run command to run the exploit and see what Metasploit gives us. So now we can either use the run command or you use the exploit command. So now you tell it to exploit. And as you can see, it says backdoor service has been spawned. Handling. You're able to get root access. Your user ID is root. It tells you it found a shell. Command shell section, meaning our exploit ran through. So what it means is that Metasploit has been able to identify the backdoor and has gained access to a shell using the backdoor. So basically what this means is we are in the system through exploiting the vulnerable FTP service. I believe that makes a lot of sense. So we've exploited FTP and we've been able to gain access to the system. So how do we confirm that we've actually gained access to the system? So it's a shell. I know what a shell is, an interactive environment between you and your target. So it means you can now begin to perform activities. Meaning if I type the ls command, I have results because I found shell. If I type who am I, it tells me root. Are we together? So that way we are actually sure that yes, we've actually found login or backdoor access on this particular system using the FTP service. So I believe we are now clear on using this exploit using FTP. If you have questions, please just jot them down. We'll have a question session. We'll have a question session by the time we're done with the practical session, so we can take the questions collectively. Just jot your questions down. Now, having treated FTP, now let's move to another protocol. Now, Now we've been able to identify now we've been able to identify VSFTPD. We've been able to identify FTP and we've been able to exploit FTP. Now let's move on to SSH and see how we can exploit SSH on this vulnerable application. Now, so first thing, we can just exit here. I can exit this guy. So the exit command exits you from the shell session. Now, in cases where you want to keep it as a session, you can save it as a session and save it so that you can always go back to it. But that's what we are doing today. So now, we've been able to identify that SSH is also running on this application. Now we want to see how we can use SSH. Now, what's SSH? SSH gives you an avenue to log into a system for remote access. So you can, it's called SSH login. So most times when you want to exploit SSH, what you're actually trying to do is you're trying to see how you can log in to SSH remotely from your attack machine or your attack box. Now, that way, because of our case scenario, we now realize we are not going to be using an exploit. What we're going to be using now is called an auxiliary module. Because remember, we said in our slides, a Metasploit doesn't just give you exploits to use, it also gives you auxiliary modules for scanning purposes and brute forcing purposes. Now, because we are trying to exploit SSH, we're going to be using something called an auxiliary. We are going to be looking out for something called an auxiliary module, not an exploit, because we are looking for what we would use to log into SSH. By the time we carry this out, we'll understand. So basically, what we are going to be doing is we're going to be finding a way to brute force SSH using Metasploit. That way, when we carry out our brute force, we can use the parameters upon success. We can now use the parameters to log in to SSH on our own. So for that case, first thing first, let's go back and then we'll search for SSH login. Okay. So there are quite a number of results here. But as long as we know what we're looking for, we should be able to identify the auxiliary module we're looking for right here. So now you find that there is an exploit. This is an exploit. We are not looking for an exploit. We're looking for an auxiliary module. This is an auxiliary scanner. But you can see here, it tells you this is for SSH and Apache, CAF. This is for command execution. This is not what we're looking for. You check for more. This is an exploit. No, this is an auxiliary scanner. SSH, Cerberus, SMTP, and we're trying to enumerate users with this. No, this is not what we're looking for. So by the time we scroll down, we should see something that just gives us SSH login that we can use to brute force SSH. And that should be so that way, okay. So that way, we'll see that we have this on number 14. So having seen that we're using number 14, which is the auxiliary scanner, SSH login. So this is what we're going to be using to see how we can brute force SSH on this particular protocol. So this is quite a different approach from what we did with FTP. This is because for here now, we're trying to brute force for credentials, login credentials. Now FTP also has login credentials, but due to the exploit we carried out, we didn't necessarily have to use login credentials because the particular exploit that was found on that VSFTPD 2.3.4 is a particular exploit that spawns a backdoor for you on the FTP service when you use a particular character to log in. So it doesn't require authentication. And that's what Metasploit helped us. That's what Metasploit helped us to do. So we didn't have to brute force for that. Although that is not for you to know as a person, just for you to identify that the exploit works and you carry it out. Now, so we're going to be using the auxiliary scanner, which is number 14, for our SSH login scanner for us to carry out our brute force attack. Now, since we identify that it's number 14, we'll just go straight to use the command use 14. And then now we're now in that particular module. Now, like we did before, after picking what you want to use, you want to set the options to make sure that yes, the prerequisites are met. So check for the options. Now, we have quite a number of requirements here. As you can see, we also need to set the R host like we did before. So we need to set the target host for our application. We also have a field that tells us to set the username or the user pass file. So the username is a specific username that you want to authenticate with. The user pass file is a list of files that contains users and passwords separated by space, one per line. You also have the user file, which is a list that contains usernames, one per line. So as much as you are setting for the user, you are setting for the passwords. The way brute forcing works, it depends on what you are brute forcing. If you are brute forcing two entries, you're brute forcing a username and a password. You want to have two lists that you're working with. If you have a username that you are sure of, but you don't know the password, it means you just have to have a name and a list. If you have a password that you're sure of, but you don't know the username itself, it means you have a password and a list of username interchangeably. But when you are sure of both of them, what do you use? You use two different lists. That way, you're going to be brute forcing an entry on this list against all entries on the other list. That's how brute forcing works, which is what we're going to be carrying out today. So for the sake of this practical, I have a small list. I have a small username list and also a small password list that we could use for demonstration, which is found on, if you just go to, I've created a list on the desktop. So we have a password file here, which contains a list, and we also have a username file here, which contains a list of usernames. So for our, we can just do mask, and this show us the list. We have a list of passwords that we hope to use to brute force. Same thing, the username also, if you decide to use username. So we also have another list of usernames. So we are going to be brute forcing these two lists against each other. This way, we hope to find one that is true that we can now use to log into SSH on our own. So having identified this, we want to set it as our user list, our user file, and as our pass file. But first things first, we want to set the R host, which is the target host. That way, you do that by setting R host, which is the IP address of our Metasploit machine, 192.168.56.102. You set that. The next thing we want to set is the user file, a file that contains username, one per line. So we'll set user file. Sorry. Set user file, and the name is usernames.txt. So this is the location of the list of usernames for Metasploit to use. So we also want to set the password file, which is this guy. We have the name here to be passwords.txt. Passwords.txt. Now let's look at our options again to be sure that everything has been set correctly. So we have our host file correct. We have our password file correct. We have our user file correct. Okay. Two other things we want to check. So now there's another requirement here that tells us stop on success. So it tells you the description is for Metasploit to stop guessing when a credentials work for a host. Meaning, by the time Metasploit is able to get a correct login detail, it stops working, and it tells you I found the correct login detail. Second one is the variables. First is let's set the stop on success. So we set stop on success. It's false currently, so we set it to true. The next thing we want to set is to set variables. So variables would show you or print all outputs for all attempts of brute force. So you see if it was false, if it was true for all the entries that Metasploit tries to use. Now, when you set variables to true, that is set. And having set all of this, now we are sure that everything is up and running and everything is set. So we can now run the exploits. And upon running our exploits, we would now see that Metasploit begins the log the brute force attempt. So now type in run and we hit enter, tells you it's starting to brute force. Now, as you can see, it starts by trying these two combinations and it tells you it's failed, meaning this is not correct. So Metasploit will keep doing this till it finds correct login applications and then it will stop. So this is the idea of brute forcing. It combines all entries together till it finds correct credentials. So we'll just wait a few minutes for it to run its scan. And upon running this, we should be able to find correct login credentials. So, yes. Okay, so we have a success. We have a success window, and as you can see, immediately it found the success, it stopped scanning. So it tells us it found two combinations, MSF admin, MSF admin. So this was successful, meaning it found a username and a password, MSF admin, MSF admin. Now that we found these two, and Metasploit has given us correct credentials, we can now use MSF, we can now use SSH itself to log in to SSH. We can use these credentials to log into SSH. That way, we would confirm that it worked. We simply could try that. Do SSH. Okay. Let's try to log in. Okay. This logging in doesn't work, but we've been able to brute force and we found valid credentials. So this confirms that we can use Metasploit to scan and at the same time get valid credentials and also find exploits. We're able to do this for other protocols too along the line. Now we've treated FTP, we've treated SSH. Let's go back to our scan and check for other protocols that we could exploit. So this has been handled. This also has been handled. So let's take a look at Telnet. Now, like I said, Telnet is more of a downgrade to SMTP, to SSH. So would we try the same thing using Telnet? That is same attempt at brute forcing to Telnet. Probably would find another scanner that can also do the same thing for us. I think that should be something we should try. Or to save us stress, since it is the same application, that is running both Telnet and SSH, we want to believe they are using the same logins. Are we together? So we want to believe they are using the same logins because SSH and Telnet are almost the same thing. SSH is just an upgrade to Telnet. So let's try to connect Telnet and see if it works. So if we try Telnet, one 192.168.56.12, highlighting the port 21. As we can see, okay, control this quit. Okay, let's just okay. So when we do Telnet, I'll try to connect Telnet using this particular network. So the command is quite simple, just Telnet IP address. Yes. Your question? Okay. So the command is just Telnet your IP address as long as Telnet is up and running on the system. So it tells you, it connects you to Metasploit using the Telnet protocol. Now, login MSF admin, which we found. This is okay. MSF admin. I'll be able to log in using the same credentials that we found from our brute force attempt using SSH. Yeah. So like I said before, if you have any questions, please just do well to document them. By the time we are done with treating about 5 or 6 of these, and we're able to wrap up our labs, then we would be able to put our questions individually. Now we'll be able to exploit Telnet, we'll be able to exploit SSH, we'll be able to exploit FTP. Now let's move further and see what else we can exploit. Okay, let's look at the SMTP protocol, which is running on port 25. Now, what is the SMTP protocol? The SMTP protocol is the simple mail transfer protocol that is used to send mails between servers and clients. So when you have an application, let's say for instance Thunderbird or what the case is, that you use to send mails, Thunderbird uses SMTP to relay mails from their mail server to the client. So now when you want to exploit SMTP, what are the things you want to exploit? You want to find as much as possible to see if you can find valid users on the mail server. That can make you ensure that, oh yes, you are able to properly enumerate and gather information on the mail server. So once again, we'll go back to Metasploit, which is our tool for the day, and see what we can find and what we can fish out that relates to SMTP. So in that case, you can just go back here and search for SMTP. Okay, so as we can see, we have quite a number or quite a lot of exploits here, but now we're looking for an exploit. So we'll try as much as possible to see how we can find something to use. Okay, so we find a scanner here. So there's a scanner that can be used to enumerate SMTP user utility. So this is an exploit that's actually a very, very important one, because this can be used to enumerate valid users on an SMTP server. So upon using this exploit, we hope to believe that we can use this exploit to gain a number of, or a list of usernames or users on the SMTP server that can be used, or that is actually resting there. And we should be able to confirm if those users actually exist. So for us to do that, that's number 41. So we just use the command use 41. And as you can see, we're now in the scanner SMTP underscore enumeration. Now we'll set our options as before. And then yes. So we see that we have just one more requirement to fill in, which is the target host, which as we are sure by now is our application's IP address. So we just set that to be 192.168.102. So confirm, and we see that everything is working correctly. You also want to be sure that the R ports that is listed in your options corresponds to the ports that you're trying to exploit. For example, SMTP runs on port 25. So you want to be sure that our port corresponds to port 25. FTP 21. If you're exploiting anything on FTP, you want to be sure that our port on FTP under your options corresponds to 21. That way, Metasploit does what it's supposed to do. Now, we can just run this exploit. And when we run the exploit, we'll wait for it to see what it can come up with. Just wait for it, bring it over to scan and give us a list of valid usernames. Okay. So while this is working, we're able to confirm that upon getting any list on SMTP enumeration, there is a way for us to verify all of the names and all of the names that Metasploit gives us to be correct. So we use a tool called Netcat. So Netcat just establishes a connection to SMTP on port 25 on that server, and then upon providing it with the username, it confirms if that username is present. And if you test it with a username that is wrong, you should be able to see that it rejects that username and tells you that username does not exist. So that way you're able to actually confirm the results of the scan properly. So you might just have to wait for a little for this to come up with its list of valid usernames. At the same time, on our remote computer, we want to clear this first. Now, right here, we can actually establish our connection with Netcat while we wait for Metasploit to give us valid usernames. So if we do Netcat 192.102 on port 25, we tell it Netcat 192.168.56.102 on port 25. As you can see, it has established a connection to metasploitable.local domain SMTP. So this is the mail server on Metasploitable. As you can see, metasploitable.local domain. So this highlights the mail server and Metasploitable is using. Now we should be able to, our scan should have finished already. Okay, yes, and as you can see, it tells us that it found some users on the system. So we have the backup, we have Bean, we have Daemon, we have FTP, we have Gnat, IRC lists, nobody. We have nobody. We have service, sync, syslog, user, whatever the cases. So it means all these are valid users on the mail server. Now, how do we confirm that these actual users actually do exist on the SMTP server, on the mail server? You can just tell this to verify. I'll pick a user. Let's say nobody. As you can see, there's actually somebody called nobody. How do I know? If I use my name, verify IMD, tells you recipient address rejected. User is unknown. That's because I'm not on the mail server. So now we can confirm that this person is not on the mail server. That way, we are sure that this person is on the mail server. This person is not on the mail server. Let's pick another name. Let's say backup. Let's try to verify backup. As you can see, backup is there. So it means the backup user is there. So this way we've been able to list and we've been able to find valid usernames on a mail server. Now, this is one of the steps in reconnaissance, reason being that, for example, in cases where you want to perform a brute force like we did during SSH login, now you'd want to ask yourself, how do you come up with the names, the things you put in your list? How do you come up with those characters? Where do you get them from? Because of course, the list has to be specific to what you're trying to brute force. Now, we would want to understand that steps like this come in handy, because now that we've found a list of valid users on a particular server, we can now use that list to create our own username list in cases where we want to brute force. In cases where we want to brute force, we can now use this list to carry that out. So now we've been able to exploit how many? We're able to exploit 1, 2, 3, 4. I think we'll take just 2 more and wrap it up for today. So, okay, so let's look at we can take a look at, okay, there's also a very funny vulnerability here called bind shell. So a bind shell is a shell, but it's not a reverse shell. Why is it not a reverse shell? Because it is a straightforward shell. A reverse shell is a reverse shell because put your payload somewhere and then you have a listener, and then the listener waits for a trigger for it to get activated. But in a bind shell is pretty straightforward, such that it can be triggered in the point of entry. Now, bind shells don't work as often as such due to the fact that there are always firewalls that block systems and block arbitrary codes like that, which is why attackers resort to using reverse shells. Because for a reverse shell can actually just be used by, for example, uploading a picture that is malicious on your profile page. That works as a reverse shell if it has a listener on it. So here we have a bind shell here, which is running quite well on port 1524. Now I said it's a very easy exploit because we can literally just connect to this shell by using the command netcat 192.168 netcat our host machine 102, and the bind shell is on port 1524. I'm just connect to 1524 and we are in. This is why I said it's a very more straightforward exploit to gain access to a system. So you see, by just using netcat to connect to this on that particular port that has a bind shell that is open, we've been able to gain access. So we didn't even have to use Metasploit for this. We didn't have to run any exploits or do anything. We just connected to the shell. Now, how am I sure that we are in the shell? Because we can list the contents of the shell. We can list the contents of the directory. We can do whatever the case is. Who am I? I'm root. Where am I? The root directory. So we're able to get system information or ifconfig. Okay, so we'll just carry out basic activities on the system just by connecting to the bind shell. That's pretty much straightforward than the ones we've been doing before. I think this is easier to understand. Okay, so let's check for more. Take for 1 or 2 more, and then we call it a day. Okay, so we have another exploit here. We have a protocol, the HTTP protocol, which is of course the web protocol running on port 80, which I believe everybody is familiar with right now. So we have Apache HTTPD 2.2.8. Now what's interesting is the fact that since we're sure that we have port 80 up and running, it means there is a web application on this server, because the HTTP protocol is a web application protocol. So it means we can actually navigate to the web application and see what it looks like. That way, you find what you're looking, you can cover more ground. Okay. So if we just type in 192.168.56.102. So yes, we actually have a web application that is up and running. And then you see that it's actually an application that is okay, that is easily navigatable. Let's take, for instance, the multi-lead. Okay, so all of this are running on the host or the target application. But then we're trying to look for how we can exploit. And remember, we said what we are looking for is, our tool for today is Metasploit. So let us stick to using Metasploit. So remember, we said as much as we confirm the protocol that is running, we want to confirm the service for the protocol that is running. And here, we see that it uses Apache 2.2.8. Apache 2.2.8. So that way, there are two things we can do. We can use Metasploit to run a proper scan on the target so we can have more information. Or last week, we spoke about a tool called Searchsploit that can be used to check for exploits. Now, we're going to be using these two tools at the same time so we can compare and contrast. Now, first things first, let's go to Metasploit. Let's go back and then let's search for HTTP. Well, we should pull off a whole bunch of results that we might not have to check it by ourselves. But if we do have the time, we can just scan through. That way, we are sure okay. Let's wait again. Search TP. So this might be a longer route for us. So in that case, let's use Searchsploit. So let's exit this guy first, and we use the command Searchsploit. Now use Searchsploit with the exact version you are trying to scan for. Now, you're sure that the version number for our HTTP protocol is Apache 2.2.8. So due to that fact, we're going to be scanning Searchsploit. Searchsploit, you are searching for exploits. That's hence the name Searchsploit. So we're going to be searching for exploits on Apache 2.2.8. So we run that. Now we have Apache 2.2.8. And then let's see what it's able to pull up for us. So we have a whole bunch of results.
Are you understanding what's happening?
I'm trying to cook. Well, maybe you should tell me a question.
Yes,
Just you want to ask the question. You're trying to.
yeah. So we use search exploit on Apache 2.2.8. And then once we do that, we're able to find quite a number of interesting exploits that can work on this particular application. But then one that catches our attention, we have this Apache plus PHP. Why is this catching our attention? Remember when we navigated through the web application, we found that there's a PHP server running on the application. We go back to that, would confirm from here that there is actually PHP running on the application. So that way, we would want to use one of these two. But then one is a Python script and one is a CGI program, one is a C program. So let's use this first one. Why are we using the first one? Because it has remote code execution. What is remote code execution? Remote code execution gives me the permission to connect to your system remotely, not physically, remotely from a remote location without authorization. Exactly. It gives me the privilege to hack your system. Let's just put it in simple terms. It's called remote code execution. So now that we've confirmed that there is a CGI application, there is a CGI-bin exploit that is running on Apache this, because this now is working with PHP version 5.3.1. Now let's go to Metasploit and see if we will find something like that fits in with, to be sure that what we're actually doing tallies. You understand? So now if we go to Metasploit, we want to search for
Before you search any question. You're digesting. Okay. Any question?
Just the library. We'll go and watch it to compare.
It's a gradual process.
So now I want to search for PHP or want to search for the exact thing we're looking for. So let's search for Apache 2.2.8. I'm not correct, 2.2.8. And we grep CGI. Now that's a new command, grep CGI. What does it mean? So when you use the word grep, you use grep to sort. For example, you tell it to scan for something. But when you scan for something, I only want results on this particular thing. So what we are saying is we're telling Metasploit to search the whole modules it has and the whole libraries it has for Apache 2.2.8. But I don't want it to give me a whole bunch of information like it did before. So give me only information that applies to CGI, because I found a CGI I'm looking for. So let's see if it does. It shows me no results from search. So let's try a different approach. So let's try PHP instead now. PHP 5.3.4 or 5.4.2. Let's see what it says. PHP 5.3.12. Yeah. Okay. Let's see. All right. So now this is the idea. Misbehaving. Okay. So we're able to identify what we are looking for. We have found it here. We're able to find PHP CGI arg injection, which is CGI argument injection. So what this tells us is, with this exploit, we should be able to have remote code execution or able to inject arbitrary code on the HTTP server. That way, we have backdoor access for us to actually work with. So we use the command use one. So as you can see, it resets itself into the exploit. So what the next thing for us to do was to set our options. Now, when we check out for our options, we can see we have quite a number of requirements to meet. One, like we did before, is the R host, which is the target host. So we'll set the target host to 192.168.56.102, right? That's one. Now, the next thing for us to do is for us to run this. But here's the thing: if we run this exploit like this, what we are trying to get is called remote code execution. Remote code execution means I should be able to have, it's quote unquote, a reverse shell. So if I have a reverse shell, it means there is a listener somewhere. And where is the listener? It's me. I'm the one listening for an established connection. But here's the thing about a listener. The reason why it's called a listener is because it has connection to the target. So it means that the target should be able to communicate with me, that is the listener. If we run this exploit like this, we're not going to have the reverse shell, or what Metasploit calls a metapreter. Why? The reason is because this listing address, which is called the listener, is not correct. My own listening address is not correct, which is this. Why is it not correct? Because that's not my IP address. So I need to check and confirm what my IP address is. So that way, Metasploit knows where to route it back to. Yes. So it routes traffic from this IP address to my own IP address. So if I run the exploit like this, take for instance, I run, it tries to start a reverse TCP handler on this guy. As you can see, this is it. So it says the exploit was completed. It was able to exploit the system, but no session was created. Why? That brings us back to what an exploit is, what a payload is. They're not the same thing. What is an exploit? An exploit is a vulnerability that an attacker. No, an exploit is a vulnerability that an attacker uses to gain access. It's a piece of code, or it's a line of code that an attacker uses to gain unauthorized access into a system. What's a payload? A payload is an aftermath of an exploit. So, like I said before, think of the exploit as it's just like when an mobile comes to rob your house, and the mobile comes and says, and then mobile boggles your door and enters into your house. What was the exploit now? The exploit was the door that he was able to boggle. That's the exploit. So also we've been seeing how we can identify the types of exploits. Like we said, we should check for the services that we're running. That explains to us how to juxtapose between services that are running on the protocol. That tells us the exploits to use. Now, but then when you exploit, when the mobile goes into the house, the next thing is, what does she do when he enters? Does she steal money, or does she come to kill? That's where the payload comes into play. So the payload is an aftermath of the exploit. So most times they call it a post-exploitation process. What happens after exploitation? So now here, it tells us that the exploit was completed. It was able to gain access, but no session was created. It's hacked, but
Nothing was.
nothing was done. That's why I cannot find. And now I should be able to identify why I couldn't listen. So we're just trying to prove the reason for us setting an appropriate listening address. So for me to get my appropriate listening address, I just have to go and find out what my listening address should be, which is this 192.168.56.1. This is because I'm using my virtual box. I'm using my virtual box adapter to listen because I'm working on VirtualBox. So I would go set my listen address. I'll set lhost to 192.168.56.1. Once this is done, let's confirm that everything is confirmed. So now that all of this is done, let's try to see if it would work this time around. As you can see, I have a interpreter, also called a shell, also called successful access, also known as successful login or successful exploitation. So now, this way we've been able to identify the need of properly setting properties when you want to run an exploit. You don't just run it off the books. Most times you get red flags because they won't work and you might not know why it's not working. So now we also identify that there's something called a listen address. There's something called the host address. You have to understand the relationship between the two. That's what enables the workflow to be successful. Now, so how do I confirm this? I mean, we've been confirming since we try the who am I. We check for who am I is not let's check. Okay, let's see. Okay, so we've been able to we can list the contents of this directory. We can cd into directory and list, and whatever the case is, we should be able to. Okay, so basically we have access to the system or the back end of the web application. Remember what we're exploiting here is the HTTP protocol. So we're basically exploited the web application protocol itself. The server is running on. So you know there are two ways to exploit an application. Is either you're exploiting the web application itself or you're exploiting the server it is working from. What we've done is we've exploited the server it is working from because we attached the protocol itself due to the vulnerability on the server it is running on. That's what we've been able to do. I think we've spoken a lot today. I think we should just do one more or two more, and then we'll call it, and then we'll go over to our labs and see how we can just complete the labs for today, and then we'll call it a day. So we have one more. Okay, let's do one more. Or we can take. We don't. Okay, we can take SMB 139.445. Let's see if we can come up with something. But in the line of this, let's just take a look at what we have for our labs today. So if we head over to hack 365 global.com, I believe we're all signed up on the labs, and I believe everyone has an account here, so you can just log into your our labs for today. And then having done that, we head over to the advanced category and Are you there? Advanced category, please. Subscription. My subscription allows.
Yes, subscription.
Just it's off for advanced. And I don't want to do this on my system because yeah. So we can just okay.
If you don't have an account, you can
Create accounts currently. Do you have an account on Labs? I can just do that quickly. Well, we probably highlight the rest. Also, it's VNC. Let's see if we can search for VNC. Okay. Use advanced. Yes.
refresh.
Okay. Okay. So we just head over to so right here we try to identify the labs for today, which happens to be the protocol hacking labs. So we have protocol hacking 1, protocol hacking 2, protocol hacking 3. So we just start from 1, and that lab is all about the file transfer protocol called the FTP. Now, we navigate in, we find the lab environment that gives a discussion on how FTP works. Now, there is a note for you to follow and for you to understand how it works. Now, FTP, from here, it says FTP is the standard network protocol used to transfer files between a client and a server on a computer network. It typically runs on port 21. Many older FTP servers have weak or vulnerable. Many older applications have weak or vulnerable configurations. So basically, in penetration testing, it is important to use FTP for anonymous login access, weak credentials, known service vulnerabilities, which are, all of these here have been tested today. I've been able to carry them out. So in this lab, which we did today, we're able to exploit VSFTPD 234. I think that was the first thing we did today, if we all remember, could well recall, which has a backdoor vulnerability triggered by a malicious username. So I think if we go back to our very first action on Metasploit. Remember, we're able to exploit SMTP as seen here. Exploited this guy, which was the backdoor command execution. So we set, remember we set our host, and then we're able to get our command exploitation. Now, let's head over to our labs. So there's a walkthrough for you to carry out and follow this machine. It says, first you can run a service version scan. You confirm that FTP is open after running this particular version, which we did. Then you launch your exploit via Metasploit, and then upon this, you open MSF console, you search for VSFTPD, you use this particular exploit, which we did, you set the target IP, which was the host that we used, and then you run your exploit. If successful, you'll get a command shell session, and you should do this by checking for who am I. Now there's a task attached. It says, after exploiting the FTP service, what is your current user privilege? Remember what the current user privilege was. Your user privilege can be found by using the command who am I or who you are on the system. So upon completion of this particular lab, we used the who am I command, and we're able to find out where our root. If you remember, we're able to find out that we are root on this system. And that way, the answer for this lab is root. This is correct answer and 50 points upon doing that. Now, let's go back.
Oh, are you on your network? No, what do you want? This one? No, this or just this one. You need the internet. Or what are you looking?
Now, head over to the advanced section.
Yes.
Then you go over to the protocol hacking lab. So we just completed protocol hacking 1. Let's head over to protocol hacking 2. So the second lab is the Telnet. It talks about the Telnet protocol, which we've been able to exploit successfully. So let's see what it has for us as a task. The Telnet is a network protocol used to provide a command line interface for remote logging. It sends data in plain text, making it insecure by modern standards. In penetration testing, Telnet is often checked for weak and default credentials, unencrypted sessions, banner grabbing, and whatever the case is. Now, for the lab walkthrough, first things that they would have us do here is to scan for Telnet. Now, remember that all these individual scans can be done at once as a comprehensive scan. So you scan for Telnet, use Nmap to check if Telnet is open. Now, upon doing that, we're able to gain access when we found login credentials when we brute force SSH that worked for Telnet. And we found that MSF admin works for Telnet too. And now we should be able to gain access to the shell. Then you enumerate the system, you check for user permissions, you look for system files, you begin local enumeration of the escalation. Now for a final task, there's a task here at hand that says that says what internet browser files are logged into the system architecture. So it means we have to find a way to navigate our way into the system using Telnet again. So for us to do that, you can just go back to the system and try to enumerate Telnet one more time. So we'll do Telnet MSF admin. MSF admin. MSF admin. MSF admin. Okay. So upon logging in with our default credentials that we found, now let's begin to enumerate. So for our lab, we've been asked to find the internet browser files which are logged into the system architecture. So let's begin the process of enumeration. So if we type ls, what do we find? We just find two files. If we type ls -la, what do we find? Oh, ls.la means you're listing everything on the directory, including hidden files. We find this, but we cannot find anything that has to do with we cannot find anything that has to do with an internet browser. So probably we should try to see how we can get. First of all, let's check who am I. By just an admin. Let's see how we can elevate our privileges. Let's perform privilege escalation and see how we can become a root user. Probably would have a bit more flexibility. So if we just perform sudo -i, you type in. Okay, now we're now root. So if I type who am I, I'm no longer just an admin. I'm now the root user. So upon being a root user, now let's try to see if we list what we get. Okay, so let's try listing all. Okay, now the results are different, and we can see there is something relating to Mozilla. So could that be our answer? cd.mozilla ls Firefox. Okay, so Mozilla or Firefox, one of them has to be the answer. Let's try Mozilla. Let's try Mozilla. Oops, wrong answer. So let's try Mozilla. Let's try it in capital letter if it's case sensitive. Wrong answer. Firefox. Okay, so Firefox is the answer. And we're able to do that by performing just a little bit of privilege escalation and listing of all the content in a directory. I believe this was a little bit straightforward, even though it had to do with a little bit of technicalities. Now, so we've solved this lab. Now let's move on to the final lab for the day, where we should be calling it a day. let's move to the last lab. So this lab is on SMB. So I think we're yet to exploit SMB. So we'll just do this from this lab. All right, so SMB, Samba, is the Linux implementation of the SMB protocol used for file and printer sharing. So it commonly runs on port 139 and port 445. Security flaws in Samba services include anonymous access to shared directories, misconfigurations, remote code execution vulnerabilities, e.g. Samba crime. Now, lab walkthrough. Scan for SMB. Yes. Lab walkthrough. First thing, scan for SMB services. You run an Nmap scan, which we did before. Second of all, it says enumerate Samba shares with SMB clients. Now, SMB-L////N. The L option lists available shares. The -N flag attempts anonymous login. Now, let's start this from command 1, this command. So, first thing, we can just copy this command and see what it gives us. Exit this, exit you. Let's see what it gives us on our remote machine. Now, let's type in the IP address 192.168.56.102. Remember, we didn't get a comprehensive scan or a comprehensive result when we ran the Nmap scan before on this, because we want to use Metasploit. So it's imperative for us to know what version of SMB is actually running on the application. That way, exploitation becomes easier for us, like we did with FTP, that gave us an actual number for the versions. Now, if we head over here, we find interesting things. Now, we find that it enumerates for quite a list for all users. And then it tells us account disabled for normal user accounts. And then we see that there is an account with the name myadmin. This is not disabled. This is working out. This is up and running for us to work with. And then there is also another user, just a user. But this is not what we're looking for. We've been able to identify something important, which is the version of the SMB that is running. As you can see here. So this is what we'll be looking for. So as we found this, having found this now, we can now go into a Metasploit and search for an exploit that works with this particular version. Or first things first, let's see if Metasploit gives us. Let's see if Metasploit gives us interesting results. Okay, interesting. It even tells us to use Metasploit. So we find something here. We find this. And this is more interesting because it even tells us to use Metasploit. So we have an actual exploit called username map scripts. So once that is, in that case, we can just go to Metasploit back and search for username map. So there is a username map script here. We found what we're looking for right here. How do I know? Because we're looking for this guy. User map script, which we were able to confirm from here. So now that we've gotten this, we can now use exploit 3. And then if we check for options, it tells us to identify the host and the listener. So basically we are trying to get a shell. So we set the host as 192.168.1.102. Now we'll set our listener to our listening machine. We check the options again. We ensure these two are correct. Then we exploit. And as you can see, seems like we've been able to get a shell. Seems like we've been able to get a shell exploiting port 139 over SMB, also known as Samba. Right? Now, it says after accessing the SMB protocol, which we've done already, after accessing the SMB protocol, retrieve the content of the retrieve type, or the retrieve text. Type complete when done. Then we have to look for something. Okay, so if we go ls, this is what we have. So what we most likely have to do here is to find a way to stabilize this shell. So there's something called shell stabilization. Now the way it is right now, it's a shell, meaning any little thing can close the shell because it's just a shell altogether. So we have to find a way to stabilize the shell. And we can stabilize the shell by spawning a dummy daemon Linux shell. We'll explain that later, but just follow along. And for me to do that, I might have to use a command python -c import a pty.spawn shell so that it spawns a bin bash shell for me. Oh shit, okay. Yeah, so basically what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to see how I can turn this from a shell to a terminal so that I can interact with it better. Because remember, the task we're giving is for us to look for a particular file in the system. So we might not be able to understand what we are doing if we are working in a shell. But if we stabilize the shell and make it a terminal, it might work better. So if we do this, as you can see, it's no longer a shell. It's now a terminal. I hope this makes sense. So having done this, having stabilized the shell, now we see that we are now inside the terminal that we can now interact with. So if we do who am I, say I'm root and I'm in the terminal. So now we're supposed to look for a file. So if we check, we do ls, let's navigate to the home directory. Let's check for user. Okay, let's check for what other things are here. Okay. Okay, I think we found it. Received file.txt. So I think if I cut received file.txt. What's that? Cut receive underscore file. Okay, so the content of the file is hello. The content of the file is hello. So I think we've been able to find the file they wanted us to find, and we've been able to see the contents of what they wanted us to check for. So that way, so the lab says type complete when you're done. So I think if I just type in complete, and I submit my yes. It said after accessing the SMTP protocol, retrieve the contents of the retrieved text. So found that there is a received file after entering the system. So the file had the content hello. So after I've done this, I can now type that I've completed this lab.
So what if I type hello? Will it correct?
It will be correct.
So okay, complete, yeah.
Just type complete when you're done. So I think we'll be able to solve all the labs. Although this last one was a little bit overboard, but it's still explanatory. So we've been able to finish all that we had to do for today. We've been able to finish all we had to do for today, and so you can feel free to redo all of these things ourselves. The machine Metasploitable VM is able to download it, open source, you can download it anywhere for you to use on your own VirtualBox. And then, having done that, I think we can now move to our question segment. So I think from now you can ask questions and just have an open discussion on all the questions we have. Now that we've completed the practical session, the labs. So over to questions. No questions.
So those questions I to ask. Are we saying no question?
I need to go back. Maybe next week. If I have difficulties.
Any questions from the online participants? Huh? Ask them what?
In their questions.
Yes, sir. Any questions from the online participants, please do well to drop right now. We'll answer them before we conclude today's session. No questions from what is it? Okay.
Any question? Was it too technical? Are you lost at some point? Cybersecurity is easy, right? Very easy. Yes, it's a gradual process. That's also why good of a person is also good to GRC. Dominance based and compliance.
Because of technical.
It's all about one interest. You might be interested in BRC, you want to go into the core, so you can do governance risk and compliance.
I don't know my it's not this technical. It's a way what is it? Compliance.
You say that of you.
Yeah, I do. I have a friends. So outside that, I'm in chat with
Metasploit is quite easy to download. You can just, it's easy enough for you to navigate. Download Metasploit. You don't know about my virtual box. Did you try it on your virtual box? VMware. Right, we'll look at that when I'm done. So, as you can see here, so you can just download Metasploit from here. So, there's a download button for you here. Then once you just download, you can just upload to your virtual machine and use. So you can just download that here right now. So you don't have to do that anymore. But then that's Metasploit. This one. What is it showing you? Sorry. I should have my network problem.
Yeah. Watch.
That's right.
Yeah, because I'm here to.
can also try VNC 3.2. So there happens to be, so let's just look at one more vulnerability from Nmap. We find that there is one other port, this VNC port that gives you remote connection to your target application via a live screen. So it gives you a GUI, a graphical user interface for you to relate to your client or your target using VNC. So this one uses the VNC 3.3 protocol. So upon using search exploits, we've been able to find that there is both of this actually Metasploit that can be used. So there is the get overflow and then there's the VNC web server. So let's try one of these and see what we're able to find. So if we type in VNC, what's our search? So we have this first one and we have this one. So let's try the both of them and see what both of them pull off. So let's try the second one first. Let's use number 5, which is Windows VNC web server. If we type 5, let's see what the settings look like. It tells me the listing address. Okay, set L host 292.168. No, that one. So this one is the if we type in the options. So let's see what this exploit does for us. Okay, this didn't work. This one. Okay, let's try something else. Let's see what's functions. Options. Okay. Let's see what this does. Okay, so it tells me that there is a listener on this guy. So what happens? Okay. This is supposed to work. I think we can just hold on this one to prevent. confusion. Okay. Right. No problem. So yeah, basically, so I believe we've been able to establish what Metasploit is and how Metasploit works, and we've been able to treat protocols individually and how we can exploit all of them. So that'll be all for today's session. We'll try to see how we can move on from there from next week. We'll be treating something very much different next week, and of course the video is going to be up, so you can always follow up on how by yourself and make it self-paced for you, so you follow it step by step. Then if you have questions here, you can always stay back, so treat them after the session is over. So I think that'll be all for me. We'll just move on to concluding this today's session. Right, so yeah, we'll be concluding now. This one. I'm done. Conclusion. 2 minutes.
All right, so thank you everyone for joining this session. See you guys next week, Saturday. And next week we'll also share before Saturday. So always look out, don't forget to subscribe and share. Yeah, thank you again for joining this session. And thank you for coming. And I believe you stayed up with this. So you also have a little bit to prepare yourself for. So I think basically saying that registering is one, right? Doing a little research is another step. You can easily grab everything because the current interest only hands-on traffic. They are limiting plenty theories. Because if we say one theory, it means we are all going back to site again. And that will take the entire time. So let's focus on the practical. So learn the little stuff so the whole thing does not sound strange. So basically, I think that. So thank you everyone, and do not forget to share. The video is actually on, so you can always do follow the steps and try to keep the labs on your own. You have access to the labs, if you don't have access, you can also let us know. So we have created a description for you. Thank you all, and have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
So the lab is still great.
Yes.